In the span of just 6 minutes on a June morning in 1942, 4 massive aircraft carriers belonging to the Imperial Japanese Navy were transformed into blazing wrecks adrift on the Pacific Ocean. These weren't just any ships. They represented the very essence of Japan's naval supremacy, the steel heart of an empire that had seemed utterly unstoppable. And the instrument of their destruction, a collection of American dive bombers that had been ridiculed and dismissed, planes so ungainly that their own crews joked about their inadequacy. Yet somehow these unlikely weapons became the tools that carved a turning point into the flesh of history itself. There's a story told about one American pilot who, before pushing his aircraft into a screaming dive toward the enemy fleet below, muttered something under his breath. He said that they didn't need the advantage of superior numbers or better equipment. What they needed was a single opportunity, one clear chance to strike. Then he pointed his plane downward and became part of something that would be remembered for generations. The morning of June 4th arrived with all the weight of destiny pressing down on the Pacific theatre. For half a year, the Japanese military had moved across the ocean and surrounding territories like an unstoppable force of nature. Every engagement seemed to end with the same grim conclusion: American and Allied forces burning, sinking, retreating. The attack on Pearl Harbor had been followed by a cascade of Japanese victories. Wake Island had fallen. The naval engagement in the Java Sea had ended in disaster for the Allies. Everywhere the Rising Sun's forces advanced, resistance crumbled. The American fleet, which had once commanded respect and inspired confidence, was hemorrhaging strength with each passing week. Ships went down, sailors died, and the perimeter of Japanese control expanded relentlessly outward from the home islands. But on that particular morning, with the sun beginning its climb over the endless expanse of water, something different was taking shape. The American carriers Yorktown, Enterprise, and Hornet were positioning themselves for what would become one of the most critical naval battles ever fought. They were preparing to face the cream of the Japanese carrier fleet: the Akagi, the Kaga, the Soryu, and the Hiryu. These 4 vessels were more than just warships. In the minds of Japanese naval officers and American sailors alike, they had taken on an almost mythological quality. They were floating fortresses, protected by swarms of the legendary Zero fighter, those swift and deadly aircraft that American pilots had learned to fear. One terrified flyer had described the Zeros as angels of death, each marked with the distinctive white circle that had come to symbolize Japanese air power. To venture into combat against these carriers and their fighter screen seemed like a form of suicide. To actually damage them appeared to be a fantasy beyond reasonable hope. Yet the Americans possessed something that would prove decisive, though it seemed almost laughable on paper. The SBD Dauntless was a dive bomber that inspired more mockery than confidence. It was slow compared to fighter aircraft. It was awkward in appearance, lacking any of the sleek beauty that people associated with modern warplanes. Its vulnerabilities were obvious to anyone who looked at it. The pilots who flew it had their own cruel nickname for the machine: the Flying Anvil. The name captured everything that seemed wrong about the aircraft. Anvils don't fly gracefully. They don't maneuver nimbly. They're heavy, blunt objects that fall under the pull of gravity. And yet, hidden within the ungainly design of the Dauntless was a capability that would prove absolutely lethal. This aircraft had been engineered specifically to plunge from great altitude in a near-vertical dive, to fall from the sky like an executioner's blade, dropping toward a condemned prisoner's neck. Inside one of these Dauntless cockpits sat Lieutenant Dick Best, a naval aviator who would soon have his name written into the history books in indelible ink. As he performed his pre-flight checks and prepared for launch, the cramped cabin around him stank of aviation fuel and human sweat. The tension was palpable, thick enough to taste. Best spoke quietly to himself, perhaps a prayer, perhaps just a statement of tactical philosophy. He said that they didn't require fair odds in this fight. They didn't need to match the enemy in numbers or quality of equipment. All they needed was a single clean shot, one perfect opportunity to strike at the vulnerable heart of the Japanese fleet. And in that moment, every SBD Dauntless, preparing to take off from the American carriers, underwent a kind of transformation. They were no longer just machines cobbled together from aluminum and steel. Each one became a weapon drawn back and ready to thrust deep into the core of Japanese naval power. The Japanese admirals, for their part, had sailed toward Midway with absolute confidence in their plan. They believed they were setting an elaborate trap that would draw out what remained of American naval strength in the Pacific and crush it decisively. They imagined the coming battle as the climactic engagement that would secure Japanese dominance over the entire ocean. What they failed to understand, what they couldn't possibly have known, was that they were actually sailing into a trap that had been carefully prepared for them. The hunters had become the hunted, though they didn't realize it yet. 6 minutes. That's the span of time that separated the before from the after. 6 minutes during which legendary warships were reduced to floating infernos. 6 minutes that would determine who would control the Pacific for the remainder of the war. 6 minutes that changed everything. To understand how this moment came to be, you have to go back to where it all started, to the beginning of the Pacific conflict and the stunning Japanese victories that made Midway possible. The war had opened with an attack so devastating that it still echoes through American memory decades later. On the 7th day of December in 1941, Japanese aircraft had swarmed over the naval base at Pearl Harbor like a lethal cloud of steel and explosives. The American battleships anchored there, vessels that had represented the backbone of naval power and national pride, had crumpled under the assault. Smoke and twisted metal had replaced the orderly rows of proud warships. In the space of just 2 hours, a carefully cultivated illusion of American invulnerability had been shattered beyond repair. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, had made a prediction that proved grimly accurate. He had told his superiors that he could run wild across the Pacific for approximately 6 months. What followed that December attack seemed to confirm his prophecy with chilling precision. The Japanese military juggernaut rolled across the Pacific and Southeast Asia with a speed and efficiency that stunned observers. The Philippines fell to Japanese control. Singapore, that supposedly impregnable British fortress, was captured in an operation that humiliated the defenders. The Dutch East Indies, with all their valuable resources, were seized. Across the vast expanse of the South China Sea and beyond, Japanese forces advanced with minimal resistance. Their warships moved with precision and speed, executing operations with a level of coordination that seemed almost superhuman. To the rest of the world, watching this rampage unfold, it appeared that the Pacific Ocean had become Japanese territory, and that nothing could stop the expansion. At the very center of this successful onslaught was a formation known as Kido Butai, which translated roughly as the Mobile Striking Force. This was the carrier task force that represented the cutting edge of Japanese naval aviation. 4 enormous aircraft carriers served as the core of this force, their decks crowded with Zero fighters and various types of strike aircraft. These carriers moved together as a unified weapon, a single blade that had been honed to razor sharpness through training and combat experience. Kido Butai had been the instrument that carved the devastation at Pearl Harbor into permanent memory. This same formation had destroyed enemy fleets, silenced defensive positions on islands across the Pacific, and sent countless ships to the bottom of the ocean. For American sailors and officers who had survived encounters with this Japanese carrier force, the names of the 4 main ships had taken on an almost demonic quality. When sailors whispered about the Akagi, the Kaga, the Soryu, and the Hiryu, there was fear in their voices. These weren't just enemy ships. They were symbols of Japanese dominance, proof that the Imperial Navy could strike anywhere and destroy anything that stood against it. Then there was Midway itself, the objective that would bring these forces into collision. On any map, Midway Atoll didn't look like much. It was essentially a speck of coral rising from the vast Pacific, a narrow strip of sand and scrub vegetation that seemed insignificant. But strategic significance has nothing to do with size. Midway's location made it critically important. Positioned roughly halfway between the Asian mainland and the Hawaiian Islands, it served as a crucial outpost. If Japanese forces could capture Midway, they would establish a forward base that threatened Hawaii itself. And if Hawaii came under serious threat, the entire west coast of the United States would be within reach of Japanese operations. The psychological impact alone would be devastating. For Admiral Yamamoto, Midway represented an opportunity too valuable to ignore. He envisioned the atoll as bait in an elaborate trap. The plan was to threaten Midway in a way that would force the weakened American Pacific Fleet to sortie from Pearl Harbor and fight in defense of the island. Once the American carriers and supporting ships were in open water, away from land-based defenses, Yamamoto intended to destroy them with overwhelming force. This would be the decisive battle that completed what Pearl Harbor had started. The American fleet would be annihilated, and Japan would achieve total naval supremacy in the Pacific. Yamamoto believed his strategy was sound, his forces superior, and his victory all but assured. He was convinced that America no longer possessed the strength to mount effective resistance against Japanese carrier power. But what Yamamoto and his fellow officers failed to account for was a uniquely American quality: stubborn refusal to accept defeat. The United States might have been battered and bleeding, outnumbered and outgunned, but surrender was not something that came naturally to the sailors and officers of the Pacific Fleet. America still possessed certain advantages, even if they weren't immediately obvious. Among those advantages was something that couldn't be measured in tonnage or aircraft counts: sheer desperation combined with determination. When your back is against the wall and retreat means catastrophe, you fight with an intensity that comfortable superiority can never match. The carrier Yorktown exemplified this desperate American resolve. She had been badly damaged during the recent engagement in the Coral Sea, wounded so severely that under normal circumstances she would have required months of repair work in a proper shipyard. But these weren't normal circumstances, and there was no time for leisurely repairs. The Yorktown had been hauled into dry dock at Pearl Harbor, and an army of workers had swarmed over her damaged hull, working around the clock to patch her up. In just 72 hours, an impossibly short span of time, enough repairs had been completed to make her marginally seaworthy and combat-capable. She was sent back to sea, still carrying her wounds, held together by determination and improvised fixes, but ready to fight. The Yorktown sailed out to join the Enterprise and the Hornet, 3 weary American carriers preparing to face 4 of the most formidable warships in the Japanese fleet. On the decks of these 3 carriers, young men stood and gazed westward across the seemingly endless expanse of ocean. They understood the mathematics of the situation. They knew their enemy's reputation. The Japanese carriers were larger, more numerous, and crewed by veterans who had been fighting continuously for 6 months. The Zero fighters that protected those carriers were superior in most performance categories to the American planes that would have to fight them. The odds of success seemed slim, and the odds of survival even slimmer. And yet, despite all this knowledge, despite the fear that must have gnawed at their guts, these young men climbed into their aircraft, strapped themselves into their cramped cockpits, and placed their trust in machines that seemed barely adequate for the task ahead. One sailor, in a diary entry written on the eve of battle, captured the mood perfectly. He wrote that they were outnumbered and outgunned, facing an enemy with proven superiority. But still, he insisted, they would fight. Because if Midway fell to the Japanese, everything behind it would be at risk. Hawaii, the West Coast, everything that made America safe would be threatened. This was the crucible moment, the point at which everything would be decided. The Japanese Empire surged forward with confidence bordering on arrogance, certain that this battle would cement their dominance over the Pacific. The Americans, bloodied but far from broken, had drawn a line and prepared to defend it with everything they had. The ocean itself seemed to be waiting, holding its breath before the storm. 2 powerful forces were racing toward a collision point, each driven by different motivations. The Japanese carried the weight of conquest and the expectation of continued victory. The Americans carried the weight of survival and the desperate need to prove they could still fight effectively. And as history has repeatedly demonstrated, survival can transform men into far more dangerous opponents than conquest ever could. When you have nothing left to lose, when your back is pressed firmly against the wall, you become capable of things that comfortable superiority cannot imagine. The two navies approaching each other represented more than just different flags and languages. They embodied fundamentally different philosophies of naval warfare, different doctrines that shaped how they fought and what they believed would bring victory. For the Imperial Japanese Navy, the path to triumph was deeply rooted in traditional thinking that stretched back through their military history. Admiral Yamamoto and his fellow officers believed in the concept of Kantai Kessen, which could be translated as the decisive battle. This wasn't just a tactical preference, it was almost a religious doctrine. Victory, in the Japanese view, would not be achieved through gradual attrition or patient strategy stretched over years. Instead, it would come in a single glorious clash, one massive engagement where superior Japanese forces would meet and destroy the enemy fleet in a kind of naval Armageddon. This belief in the decisive battle was the samurai spirit translated into modern naval strategy. The sword stroke that cuts an opponent in half with one perfect swing. The carriers of Kido Butai were the physical embodiment of this philosophical approach. They were sleek and fast, designed for aggressive operations. More importantly, they were concentrated into a single powerful formation. 4 carriers sailing together, supporting each other, creating a defensive network of fighters and a massive offensive punch. They operated as one unified weapon, a blade wielded by the Empire. But there's a fundamental weakness in the sword metaphor that the Japanese seemed not to fully appreciate. A blade, no matter how sharp or beautifully crafted, offers no second chances when it breaks. If your entire strategy depends on one decisive engagement and that engagement goes wrong, there's no backup plan, no forgiveness, no recovery. The Americans, by contrast, had been forced to abandon any luxury of beautiful philosophical frameworks. Pearl Harbor had burned that kind of thinking out of them. Their doctrine had been forged in necessity, shaped by survival, and written in the blood of costly mistakes. The Battle of the Coral Sea had been a stumbling, inconclusive affair where both sides lost ships and learned painful lessons. The Americans discovered that speed and aggression meant nothing without precision, that courage alone couldn't substitute for intelligence, for knowing where the enemy was and what he intended to do. And so, the United States Navy, with its pragmatic streak running deep, turned toward a different approach. They didn't worship the idea of the single decisive duel. Instead, they worshipped the grind, the slow accumulation of advantages, the patient application of pressure. Most critically, they learned to listen to their codebreakers, those anonymous men working in silence at a facility called Station Hypo. These codebreakers labored in a basement in Hawaii, sweating over encrypted Japanese naval messages, working to unravel the secrets hidden in the cipher system known as JN25. It was painstaking work, requiring mathematical skill, linguistic knowledge, and endless patience. But slowly, piece by piece, these men began to pull threads from the Japanese cipher until the entire fabric started to come apart. They decoded enough messages to reveal the outline of Yamamoto's grand plan. They learned that a major operation was being planned. They learned approximately when it would occur. And through a clever deception, they even confirmed the target. The Americans sent out a false message in a code they knew the Japanese could read, claiming that Midway was experiencing a shortage of fresh water. When Japanese intelligence reported back that location AF was short on water, the American codebreakers had their confirmation. AF was the Japanese designation for Midway. The target was known, the approximate timing was known. Suddenly, Japan's carefully planned surprise attack was no surprise at all. The hunters who thought they were setting a trap discovered, too late, that they were actually walking into one. The Japanese fleet would sail toward what they believed was an unsuspecting target, and instead they would find American carriers waiting in ambush. The tools available to the Americans for this ambush were a mixed collection of aircraft, ranging from barely adequate to dangerously obsolete. On the flight decks of those three carriers, different types of planes prepared for combat, each with its own strengths and glaring weaknesses. There was the F-4F Wildcat, the primary American fighter. In one-on-one combat with a Zero, the Wildcat was at a disadvantage. The Japanese fighter was faster, more maneuverable, and generally superior in a turning dogfight. But the Wildcat had one critical advantage. It was tough. The aircraft could absorb battle damage that would tear a Zero apart. It could take punishment and keep flying, could protect its pilot when things went wrong. In the hands of a skilled pilot who understood its strengths and didn't try to dogfight Zeros on their terms, the Wildcat could be effective. Then there was the SBD Devastator, the torpedo bomber that would carry the burden of the initial American attack. The Devastator was hopelessly obsolete by 1942 standards. It was slow, ungainly, and desperately vulnerable. Carrying a torpedo required the aircraft to make a long, straight approach run at low altitude, maintaining steady course and speed to ensure the torpedo would release properly. This made the Devastator a perfect target for enemy fighters and anti-aircraft fire. The men who flew Devastators knew they were being sent into combat in aircraft that were little better than flying coffins. It was a death sentence disguised as a mission assignment. But someone had to make the torpedo attacks, and the Devastator squadrons would carry that burden. And then there was the SBD Dauntless, the dive bomber that would ultimately prove to be the decisive weapon of the battle. The Dauntless would never win any beauty contests. She wasn't sleek or fast or particularly elegant. She looked exactly like what she was, a sturdy, practical aircraft designed to perform a specific job. But hidden within that ungainly airframe was a capability that made her absolutely lethal against large surface ships. The Dauntless was equipped with perforated steel dive brakes, large panels that could extend from the wings and tail to create massive air resistance. These dive brakes allowed the aircraft to plunge toward its target at an almost vertical angle without accelerating to the point where it would tear itself apart or become uncontrollable. With those brakes deployed, a skilled pilot could aim not at some vague point on the ocean, not at the general vicinity of an enemy ship, but at a specific spot on a carrier's deck. He could place his bomb with a precision that horizontal bombing could never achieve. One bomb, delivered with accuracy, could punch through a carrier's flight deck and detonate inside the hangar bay where armed and fueled aircraft were waiting. The result would be catastrophic. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, who would lead one of the American dive bomber squadrons into battle, studied his maps and briefing materials with the full knowledge that many of his men might never return. He told his squadron that they wouldn't get second chances in this fight. It was all or nothing. They would either break the back of the Japanese carrier force or be broken themselves. There was no middle ground, no possibility of a draw. Everything rode on the success or failure of the coming attack. On the other side of the ocean, Japanese officers sat in their wardrooms aboard the carriers of Kido Butai, drinking tea beneath banners that proclaimed previous victories. Their attitude toward the coming battle was marked by confidence that bordered on casual certainty. To these men, Midway was already as good as won. The Americans might put up some resistance, might bloody themselves in futile attacks, but the outcome was foreordained. Japanese superiority would prevail, as it had prevailed in every engagement since the war began. This was the collision point between belief and reality, between what the Japanese assumed would happen and what was actually going to unfold. The Empire trusted in its invincible blade, in the proven superiority of its carriers and aircraft and pilots. America trusted in a handful of ungainly dive bombers and the desperate courage of young men who had nowhere left to retreat. And very soon those dive bombers would fall from the sky like avenging angels, and everything would change. The stage had been meticulously set. The trap had been carefully laid. The chess pieces were positioned for the critical move. The entire world, though most of it didn't yet know, was holding its breath, because the next few hours would decide not just the fate of Midway Atoll, not just the balance of power in the Pacific, but potentially the outcome of the entire war. When dawn arrived over Midway on the 4th of June, it came with a particular quality of light that seemed almost ominous. The sky took on a deep crimson glow as the sun began to rise, painting the Pacific Ocean in shades that looked like blood spilled across water. This happened before a single shot had been fired, before any aircraft had left their carriers, but it felt like a preview of what was coming. On the decks of the Enterprise, the Hornet, and the Yorktown, the roar of aircraft engines shattered the early morning quiet. Wings trembled with contained power. Propellers slashed through the air, and young men, most of them barely out of their teens, climbed into cockpits and prepared to gamble their lives in machines that seemed barely worthy of the task they were being asked to perform. The orders these pilots received were simple to the point of being stark. Launch your aircraft. Locate the enemy fleet. Kill the carriers. But beneath those clipped military phrases lay a truth that every pilot understood with perfect clarity, even if nobody said it out loud. The majority of them would not be returning to their carriers. The fuel calculations were tight, the distances were long, and the Japanese fleet would not be destroyed without terrible sacrifice. This was a one-way mission for many of the men climbing into those planes, and they knew it. The first aircraft to launch were the torpedo squadrons, flying the obsolete SBD Devastators. These planes were relics from an earlier era of naval aviation, slow and vulnerable in ways that made them nearly suicidal in the modern aerial environment. But torpedoes were among the few weapons that could sink a large carrier, and someone had to deliver them. The Devastators were tasked with flying low over the ocean, straight toward the Japanese fleet, maintaining steady course and speed while releasing their torpedoes at close range. It was a mission profile that offered minimal chance of survival. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron commanded Torpedo Squadron 8, flying from the Hornet. Before his squadron launched, Waldron gathered his men around him on the flight deck. The noise of engines made quiet conversation impossible, but the men could read his lips and catch his words. He told them that if there was only one plane left in the sky at the end of this attack, he wanted that man to press on and get a hit. His voice carried no illusions about what was being asked. This wasn't just a dangerous mission. It was a death sentence wrapped in the language of duty and honor. As the Devastators lifted away from their carriers, engines straining to carry the weight of aircraft and torpedoes into the air, the men who remained on deck watched in silence. There was nothing to say. They were watching their brothers, their friends, vanish into history. The likelihood of seeing these men again was remote, and everyone knew it. High above the torpedo bombers, flights of F-4F Wildcats clawed their way into the sky, climbing to provide fighter cover for the strike. The Wildcats were outmatched by the Japanese Zeros in most performance categories, but they carried something more important than speed or maneuverability. They carried stubborn toughness, the ability to absorb damage and keep fighting. Their role in the coming attack was absolutely thankless. They were supposed to hold off the swarm of enemy fighters, to bleed for the bombers, to buy seconds and minutes with their own lives. Higher still, at altitudes where the air grew thin and cold, the squadrons of SBD Dauntless dive bombers circled in patient formation. Their moment had not yet arrived. For now, they were simply shadows moving through scattered clouds, waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike. They needed the Japanese carriers to be distracted, needed the enemy's attention focused elsewhere. So they waited, engines droning steadily, pilots scanning the ocean far below for any sign of the enemy fleet. At sea level, the first sacrifice was about to begin. The Devastator squadrons lumbered toward the location where the Japanese carriers were believed to be operating. Their torpedoes hung beneath their bellies, deadly weapons that made the already slow aircraft even more sluggish. And from above, death descended with terrifying speed. The Japanese Zero fighters, scrambled to intercept the American attack, dove onto the torpedo bombers like hawks falling on crippled prey. The sky erupted with the sound of machine gun fire, the sharp crack of cannon shells, and the horrific noise of aircraft being torn apart in mid-air. One by one, with awful regularity, the American torpedo bombers exploded into fireballs that briefly illuminated the sky before splashing into the ocean below. Some were hit in their fuel tanks and simply disintegrated. Others caught fire and spiraled downward, trailing smoke. A few managed to jink and dodge for a few extra seconds, but the outcome was inevitable. Within minutes, entire squadrons were shredded. Torpedoes that should have been launched at the enemy carriers instead went down with their aircraft, never released, their potential unfulfilled. The sacrifice was horrific in its completeness. Torpedo Squadron 8, which had launched with 30 men aboard 15 aircraft, was effectively annihilated. 29 of those 30 men died in the attack. Their planes were shot out of the sky or crashed into the ocean. The torpedoes they carried never threatened the Japanese carriers. Only one man from the entire squadron survived, Ensign George Gay. He was shot down like the others, but his aircraft ditched intact enough for him to escape. He found himself floating alone in the vast Pacific, clinging to a seat cushion from his destroyed plane, watching the battle continue to unfold around him. His words, recorded later after his rescue, carried a haunting quality. He described being completely alone, watching his squadron burn and fall from the sky, seeing men he had trained with and lived with die in front of him. But he also noted something critically important. They had accomplished something, even in their destruction. They had drawn the wolves away from the main target. On the bridges of the Japanese carriers, officers watched the slaughter of the American torpedo bombers with a sense of grim satisfaction. This seemed to confirm everything they believed about Japanese superiority and American desperation. The enemy had thrown its aircraft at Kido Butai in what appeared to be a futile, uncoordinated attack. The result had been predictable: American planes destroyed with minimal damage to the Japanese fleet. To the officers and sailors of the Akagi, the Kaga, the Soryu, and the Hiryu, it seemed that the enemy had played its last card and failed. The battle appeared to be effectively over, but arrogance and assumption carry a steep price in combat. While the Japanese celebrated their apparent victory, their carriers were in a state that would prove catastrophically vulnerable. The flight decks were crowded with aircraft being rearmed and refueled. Bombs were being rolled out of magazines and loaded onto bombers. Torpedoes, enormous and heavy, were being hoisted into position with cranes and carts. Most dangerously, fuel lines had been run across the wooden flight decks to feed the waiting aircraft. The ships had been preparing to launch their own strike, and in the rush to get aircraft ready, safety had been sacrificed for speed. The carriers had essentially turned themselves into floating powder kegs, packed with explosives and highly flammable aviation fuel. Moreover, the Japanese Zeros had been pulled down to low altitude to massacre the American torpedo bombers. This meant that the sky above the Japanese fleet was largely unguarded. The fighter screen that should have been maintaining high-altitude patrol had descended to participate in the slaughter below, and somewhere in those high clouds, patient wings continued to circle. The SBD Dauntless squadrons had been searching for the enemy, burning precious fuel as they crisscrossed the ocean looking for targets. Some of the American strike groups had gotten lost, had searched in the wrong area, had failed to find the Japanese fleet, but others had caught a crucial piece of luck. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, leading one group of dive bombers, had made the agonizing decision to extend his search even though fuel was running critically low. He knew that if he didn't find the enemy soon, his aircraft wouldn't have enough fuel to return to their carrier. They would run dry and ditch in the ocean. But he kept searching, kept looking, driven by the knowledge that if they didn't find those carriers, the entire mission would fail. And then he spotted something that changed everything: the wake of a Japanese destroyer cutting across the ocean at high speed. The ship was heading northeast, moving fast, clearly rushing to rejoin the main fleet after performing some detached duty. McCluskey made an instant decision. He followed that wake. The destroyer unknowingly led him straight to the heart of Kido Butai, straight to the carriers that McCluskey had been desperately searching for. When he looked down through his cockpit canopy and saw them, when he identified those 4 massive carriers steaming in formation below him, he must have felt a surge of emotion that combined relief and terror and anticipation. The targets were there, exposed and apparently unaware of the danger descending from above. McCluskey keyed his radio transmitter and spoke a single word that would echo through history. Attack. The sacrifice of the torpedo squadrons had not been meaningless. They had pulled the Japanese fighter screen down to wave-top level. They had distracted the enemy and focused Japanese attention on the low-altitude threat. They had essentially pulled open the shield, creating a gap in the defences. And now the hammer was positioned perfectly to fall through that gap and strike with devastating force. The moment of reckoning had finally arrived. The clock showed 20 minutes past 10 in the morning on the 4th of June, 1942. The sky above Midway Atoll, above the ocean where the Japanese carrier force steamed in confident formation, seemed to split open as if torn apart by an invisible hand. From an altitude of 14,000 feet, the squadrons of SBD Dauntless dive bombers rolled into their attacks. Each pilot pushed his control stick forward, pointing the nose of his aircraft downward, and the machines responded by dropping toward the ocean below. The engines screamed with the strain. The dive brakes deployed with a shuddering vibration that pilots could feel through their entire aircraft. Each plane transformed from a level flying machine into a falling spear, gravity itself weaponized into an instrument of destruction. Far below, the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy continued its routine operations with no sense of impending doom. The Akagi, the Kaga, the Soryu, these carriers gleamed with purposeful activity. Their flight decks were organized chaos as crews worked frantically to prepare aircraft for launch. Bombs sat lined up in neat rows, waiting to be loaded. Torpedoes rested on wheeled carts, positioned near the aircraft that would carry them. Fuel lines snaked across the wooden deck planking, hissing slightly as aviation gasoline flowed through them to fill aircraft tanks. The crews scrambled about their duties, moving with practiced efficiency. They had performed these tasks dozens of times before, preparing strikes that had devastated enemy forces from Pearl Harbor to the Java Sea. There was no reason to think this time would be any different. But this time was catastrophically different. The crews working on those flight decks never looked up. They never saw the death that was already plunging toward them from the sky. The first bombs were already falling by the time anyone aboard the Japanese carriers realized they were under attack. At 22 minutes past 10, Wade McCluskey's group struck first. They had targeted the Kaga, one of the larger Japanese carriers. McCluskey himself picked his aim point carefully, pushing his Dauntless into a dive so steep that the ocean seemed to rush upward like a wall of blue that would smash his aircraft to pieces. The wind screamed past his canopy. The entire airframe rattled and shook with the stress of the dive. His vision narrowed as G-forces from the pullout began to compress his body. Everything in the world compressed down to a single point of focus, the target. He selected a spot on the carrier's broad deck, compensated for wind and the ship's movement, and squeezed the release trigger. 1,000 pounds of steel and high explosive dropped away from his aircraft, beginning its own brief journey from the sky to the target below. Seconds later, the horizon transformed. A massive explosion erupted from the Kaga's flight deck, a blast so powerful that it was visible from miles away. The bomb had struck true, punching through the wooden deck planking and detonating inside the hangar bay below. That hangar bay was packed with armed and fueled aircraft, creating the perfect conditions for catastrophe. The initial explosion triggered a cascade of secondary detonations as bombs cooked off and fuel tanks erupted. Within moments, the entire carrier had transformed into a furnace. Flames shot hundreds of feet into the air, climbing higher than the ship's superstructure. Smoke, thick and black and greasy, boiled upward to form a pillar that could be seen from horizon to horizon. The Kaga, that mighty warhorse that had been part of the attack on Pearl Harbor, that had terrorized the Pacific for 6 months, was finished. It had taken less than 3 minutes from the moment of bomb impact to complete devastation. The carrier was transformed from a functioning warship into a burning wreck that would soon slip beneath the waves, taking hundreds of her crew with her. At 24 minutes past 10, just 2 minutes after the cargo was hit, another Dauntless squadron dove on the Akagi. This carrier was special. She was the flagship of Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, the commander of Kido Butai himself. The Akagi was not just a carrier, she was a symbol, the ship from which the Pearl Harbor attack had been coordinated. Lieutenant Richard Best, leading a small section of just 3 dive bombers, selected the Akagi as his target. He aimed for the distinctive rising sun emblem painted on the carrier's flight deck, using it as his point of reference. Best felt his aircraft tremble as he pushed into the dive. The G-forces crushed his body, compressing his lungs until breathing became difficult. His vision started to narrow from the edges, the first sign of grey-out from insufficient blood flow to his brain. But he held his dive steady, made minute corrections with stick and rudder, and whispered to himself that this one had to count. When he released his bomb, he could feel the aircraft suddenly lighten as the heavy weapon fell away. Then he pulled back hard on the stick, hauling his Dauntless out of the dive, the ocean surface passing terrifyingly close beneath his wings. Behind him, his bomb completed its journey. It smashed through the flight deck elevator, that large platform used to move aircraft between the hangar and the flight deck. The explosion that followed buckled the ship's structure and ignited everything flammable within range. The Akagi's hangar bay, like the Kaga's, was packed with armed and fueled aircraft. The result was predictable and horrific. The ship bucked from the force of internal explosions. Then it belched forth a torrent of black smoke and orange fire that consumed everything. Admiral Nagumo, standing on the bridge of his flagship, felt the deck shake beneath his feet as the pride of Kido Butai burned around him. A single bomb, delivered with precision, had crippled the very heart of the Japanese carrier force. 2 carriers burning. But the American dive bombers were not finished. At 26 minutes past 10, the Dauntless squadrons from the Yorktown, which had been searching independently, finally located the Japanese fleet and began their attack run. They selected the Soryu as their target. 3 bombs from this attack struck home within seconds of each other. The destruction was, by this point, almost routine. Massive orange fireballs ripped through the carrier's hangar bays. The heat was so intense that metal began to melt. Sailors who had been working on the flight deck were flash-burned or blown overboard by the force of explosions. Those trapped below decks found themselves in a nightmare of smoke and fire with no escape. The screams of dying men were lost in the roar of flames. From miles away, other ships could see the black pillar of smoke rising from the Soryu, another marker of destruction added to the growing collection. 3 Japanese carriers destroyed in the span of just 6 minutes. The backbone of the Empire's naval air power had been snapped like a dry twig. The ocean around the burning carriers began to fill with wreckage, with debris, with the bodies of sailors who had jumped overboard to escape the flames or who had been blown into the water by explosions. One Japanese sailor who survived the attack recalled later, with obvious trauma in his voice, how they had looked up and seen the American dive bombers falling toward them. He said they appeared like demons dropping from the sky, like gods of death, like some unstoppable force of nature given physical form. The speed of the attack, the precision of it, the utter devastation it caused in such a brief span of time, all of it seemed almost supernatural to men who had believed their fleet was invincible. But Japan was not completely finished. One carrier remained operational, the Hiryu. She had been steaming slightly separated from the main formation, which meant she wasn't caught in the initial wave of American dive bomber attacks. The Hiryu represented the last sword still unsheathed, the final chance for Japanese naval aviation to strike back and salvage something from this catastrophe. At 11 o'clock in the morning, Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi, commanding from the Hiryu, launched a counterattack. His aircraft roared off the deck and went hunting for the American carriers that had caused such devastation. They found the Yorktown. The Japanese strike planes swooped down on the already damaged American carrier and pressed home their attack with the skill and determination that had made Japanese naval aviation feared across the Pacific. Bombs struck the Yorktown, tearing through her flight deck. Torpedoes slammed into her hull below the waterline. The carrier shuddered under the impacts, listing to one side as flooding spread through her compartments and fires broke out in multiple locations. For a brief moment, for just an hour or two, it seemed that Japan had tasted revenge, had struck back at the enemy who had destroyed 3/4 of Kido Butai. But vengeance, satisfying as it might feel, could not save the Japanese fleet from its fate. By mid-afternoon, American search planes had located the Hiryu. The carrier's position was radioed back to the Enterprise, and a fresh strike was rapidly organized. At 5 o'clock in the afternoon, Dauntless dive bombers from the Enterprise found their target and rolled into their attacks. 4 bombs, delivered with the same precision that had destroyed the other carriers, slammed into the Hiryu's flight deck. The explosions ripped through her hangar bays just as they had with the Akagi, the Kaga, and the Soryu. Fire consumed the ship from within. Her fate was sealed. Admiral Yamaguchi, faced with the destruction of his carrier and the annihilation of Kido Butai, made a decision that reflected the samurai tradition of his culture. He refused evacuation. As his staff and many of the crew abandoned ship, Yamaguchi chose to remain aboard, to die with the Hiryu. When the carrier finally slipped beneath the waves during the night, Admiral Yamaguchi went down with her, accepting responsibility for the disaster and choosing death over the shame of survival and defeat. In the space of less than a full day, the mighty Kido Butai had ceased to exist. 4 carriers destroyed, transformed from the cutting edge of naval aviation into burning hulks scattered across miles of Pacific Ocean. More than 3,000 Japanese sailors and airmen were dead, drowned or burned or killed by explosions. The elite carrier air crews, those veteran pilots who had attacked Pearl Harbor and ranged across the Pacific in 6 months of virtually uninterrupted victory, were consumed in the fires that devoured their ships. These men were irreplaceable. Japan could build new carriers given enough time and resources, but creating new veteran pilots required years of training that they no longer had. Lieutenant Richard Best, the man whose bombs had delivered a fatal blow to the Akagi, sat in his cockpit as he flew back toward the Enterprise. Smoke from the burning Japanese carriers trailed across the horizon behind him, visible for dozens of miles. He knew what had just happened. He had witnessed an empire fall in the space of 6 minutes. He had been part of something that would be remembered for as long as people studied warfare and naval history. The Pacific Ocean roared with the sound of fire consuming steel. The sky thundered with the echo of explosions that rolled across miles of open water, and history itself seemed to bend under the weight of what had just occurred. Midway was not just a battle in the conventional sense. It was an execution, a sudden and brutal demonstration that arrogance and assumed superiority could be undone by precision, intelligence, and desperate courage. Night descended slowly over the Pacific, but the ocean continued to burn. The bodies of thousands of men drifted in water slicked with oil and debris. Their cries for help, for rescue, gradually faded as exhaustion and hypothermia claimed those who had survived the initial destruction. The ships that had been their homes, the 4 carriers that represented the pride and power of the Imperial Japanese Navy, continued to glow like massive funeral pyres drifting on the horizon. The Akagi, the Kaga, the Soryu, the Hiryu. These names that had once been whispered with fear by American sailors were now attached to broken, burning hulks slowly sinking into the deep. Japan had wagered everything it had on the Midway operation. Yamamoto had envisioned it as the decisive battle that would crush what remained of American naval power in the Pacific and establish Japanese dominance for years to come. Instead, in the span of one terrible day, Japan had lost more than just ships and men. It had lost its strategic initiative. It had lost its aura of invincibility. It had lost its future. The statistics told a grim story. Over 3,000 Japanese sailors and airmen gone, their bodies now resting on the bottom of the Pacific or floating among the wreckage. 250 aircraft reduced to molten metal and ashes, destroyed aboard their carriers or lost in combat. But the most damning loss of all, the one that would haunt Japan for the remainder of the war, was the destruction of those irreplaceable carrier pilots. The veteran aviators who had flown at Pearl Harbor, who had honed their skills in combat across half a year of continuous operations, were dead. Their knowledge, their experience, their expertise, all of it went down with the burning carriers or was scattered across the ocean. Japan could theoretically build replacement carriers if it devoted enough industrial capacity to the task. But creating replacement pilots of the same quality would require years of intensive training, and time was the one resource Japan no longer possessed. For the United States, the contrast was sharp and significant. American forces had risked everything in the battle and had indeed bled terribly for their victory. The Yorktown, that stubborn warrior that had been patched up and sent back into battle despite her wounds, now lay crippled and helpless. A Japanese submarine would soon find her and deliver torpedoes that would send her to the bottom, another casualty added to the price of victory. Dozens of American airmen had not returned from their missions. The torpedo squadrons in particular had been virtually annihilated, their brave crews swallowed by the Pacific in their futile attacks that nevertheless created the opening for the dive bombers to exploit. But despite these losses, despite the blood and sacrifice, the United States still had 2 carriers operational and capable of fighting. The Enterprise and the Hornet remained afloat, their crews battered but unbroken, ready to continue the war. More importantly, America still possessed pilots who could fly, maintainers who could fix damaged aircraft, and an industrial infrastructure that was already ramping up production to unprecedented levels. New carriers were being built in shipyards on both coasts. New aircraft were rolling off assembly lines. New pilots were being trained at schools across the country. The flow of men and material was accelerating, and nothing Japan could do would stop it. The rising sun, which had seemed utterly unstoppable just 6 months earlier, now found itself trembling. One Japanese naval officer, in a moment of stark honesty recorded after the war, confessed that Midway represented more than just a tactical defeat. He said that at Midway, Japan lost not just ships and men, but lost the war itself. From that day forward, from the moment those 4 carriers slipped beneath the waves, Japan was simply waiting for the inevitable end. They would continue to fight, would continue to inflict casualties and win occasional tactical victories, but the strategic outcome had been determined. For America, Midway represented transformation. The Navy that had been hunted, that had spent 6 months retreating and absorbing losses, suddenly became the hunter. The psychological shift was as important as the material one. American sailors and pilots had proven to themselves that the Japanese could be beaten, that the vaunted carrier force could be destroyed, that courage and intelligence could overcome numerical inferiority. The path to future operations opened that very night. Guadalcanal, the first major American offensive in the Pacific, would be launched just 2 months later. The Long Island hopping campaign that would eventually bring American forces to the doorstep of the Japanese home islands began with the victory at Midway. And at the center of this transformation, at the heart of everything that had happened, was a machine that had been dismissed and mocked. The SBD Dauntless, that ungainly dive bomber that pilots had jokingly called the Flying Anvil, had carved its designation into eternal memory. It had become the executioner of carriers, the angel of death, descending from the clouds with surgical precision. The pilots who flew the Dauntless, men like Wade McCluskey and Richard Best, had turned desperation into destiny. They had taken a situation that seemed hopeless, odds that appeared impossible, and through skill and courage and sheer stubborn determination, they had created victory from the jaws of defeat. The legacy of Midway extended far beyond the immediate tactical and strategic results. It served as a permanent warning about the dangers of arrogance in warfare. The Japanese had sailed toward Midway with absolute confidence in their superiority, certain that their veteran forces would easily handle whatever the depleted American fleet could throw at them. That arrogance had blinded them to vulnerabilities, had caused them to underestimate their enemy, and had led them into a trap they never saw coming. The battle demonstrated that in war, information and precision can often outweigh raw numbers and material superiority. The American codebreakers who had unraveled Japanese intentions, the dive bomber pilots who had placed their bombs with devastating accuracy, these factors had proven more decisive than Japan's larger carrier force and more experienced crews. The lesson was clear. Wars are not won by assumptions of racial or cultural superiority, nor by resting on past victories. They are won by adaptation, by learning from mistakes, by using intelligence in all its forms, and by maintaining the will to fight even when the odds seem insurmountable. As dawn broke over the Pacific on the 5th of June, over an ocean now littered with wreckage and the dead, the fundamental balance of power in the theatre had shifted. The Pacific was no longer a Japanese lake. It had become contested waters where American forces would increasingly dictate the terms of engagement. History tends to remember Midway simply as a battle, as a military engagement that occurred on a particular date in a particular place. But to understand it purely in those terms is to miss the deeper significance. Midway was a reckoning, a moment when the course of the entire Pacific War pivoted in a matter of minutes. In those 6 extraordinary minutes when the American dive bombers struck the Japanese carriers, when 4 massive warships were transformed from instruments of power into burning wrecks, the myth of Japanese invincibility shattered like glass. The Pacific Ocean, which had seemed like a Japanese domain where their carriers could operate with near impunity, shifted overnight into a battleground where American forces could fight and win. What makes this moment so profoundly significant, what gives it such haunting power even decades later, is the incredible contrast between the two sides. On one hand, you had an empire that had grown drunk on its own success, blinded by the string of victories that had followed Pearl Harbor, confident to the point of arrogance that their superiority was absolute and their plans were foolproof. On the other side, you had a fleet that had been battered and bloodied, thrown together from whatever could be scraped together and patched up, manned by sailors and pilots who understood they were outnumbered and outgunned but refused to surrender. The Americans trusted in intelligence gathered by anonymous codebreakers, in crude machines that were barely adequate for the task, and in the raw courage of young men who climbed into cockpits knowing many of them would never return. Midway proved conclusively that wars are not won by arrogance, nor by the mythology that surrounds supposedly superior warriors or supposedly invincible weapons systems. They are won by precision, by intelligence in every sense of that word, by sacrifice, and by the ability to endure when things seem darkest. Lieutenant Richard Best, whose bombs had crippled both the Akagi and contributed to the destruction of the Hiryu, spoke later about his role in the battle. He was humble about his actions, saying that he had simply done what he was trained to do, that he had followed his orders and performed his duty. But then he added something that captured the human cost of the victory. He said that he would never forget the faces of the men who had not come back, the pilots who had climbed into their aircraft that morning and vanished into the Pacific, never to return to their carriers. His words echo a truth that too often gets lost in discussions of tactics and strategy. Victory in war is always carved from loss. Every success is purchased with blood. The torpedo bomber crews who were slaughtered by Zero fighters and anti-aircraft fire, who never delivered their weapons but who pulled the Japanese fighter screen out of position, paid for the success of the dive bombers with their lives. The young sailors aboard the Yorktown who kept their ship fighting even as Japanese bombs and torpedoes tore into her hull paid for American persistence with their sacrifice. Victory at Midway came at a terrible cost, even if that cost was far less than what Japan suffered. For Japan, Midway represented not just a defeat, but the beginning of a long, grinding decline toward inevitable surrender. Admiral Yamamoto, who had planned the Midway operation with such care and confidence, reportedly said nothing when he received news of the disaster. He simply retired to his cabin aboard the battleship Yamato and sat in silence. He understood what had happened. He understood that the war he had warned against, the war he had said Japan might win for 6 months before American industrial power overwhelmed them, had just reached its turning point. Those 6 months of running wild were over, and now the long, terrible grind would begin. For America, Midway became the foundation for everything that followed. It provided the breathing space to rebuild the fleet, to train new pilots, to gather forces for offensive operations. Just 2 months after Midway, Marines would land on Guadalcanal, beginning a brutal 6-month campaign that would push American forces up through the Solomon Islands. From there, the island-hopping strategy would develop, moving American power inexorably closer to Japan itself. Each battle brought new casualties, new lessons, new horrors. But the strategic initiative, seized at Midway, would never be relinquished. Beyond the immediate military and strategic implications, Midway left behind questions that continue to resonate. How is it possible that 6 minutes of combat can define the destiny of millions of people? How can a single decision, made by a pilot in the cramped cockpit of a dive bomber, turn entire oceans into graveyards and reduce empires to ashes? The SBD Dauntless, that aircraft which had been mocked as a flying anvil, which had seemed so ungainly and inadequate, became the instrument through which fate expressed itself. It was just a machine, constructed from aluminum and steel, powered by a single engine, controlled by a human pilot who was as fragile and mortal as anyone else. Yet in the hands of skilled men, guided by accurate intelligence and driven by desperate necessity, this crude weapon rewrote the course of history. The legacy of Midway endures in ways that extend far beyond the pages of history textbooks. It lives in the silence that follows great battles, the silence of an ocean that has swallowed 4 enormous warships and thousands of men, the silence of survivors who watched their world sink beneath the waves and could never quite find words adequate to describe what they had witnessed. It lives in the memory of those who never rose from the waters, the young men who climbed into aircraft on a June morning and flew off into oblivion, their names now carved on memorials, but their bodies resting forever in the Pacific depths. Midway demonstrated with brutal clarity that warfare is not a game of chance where luck determines outcomes. It is a deadly serious contest where intelligence, preparation, courage, and sacrifice combine to create results. The American victory was not a matter of fortune. It was the result of code breakers who worked tirelessly to penetrate Japanese communications, of mechanics who kept aging aircraft flying, of pilots who trained relentlessly to perfect the dangerous art of dive bombing, of commanders who made correct decisions under intense pressure, and of young men who flew into combat knowing the odds against their survival but doing their duty anyway. If there is a single haunting thought that emerges from contemplating Midway, it might be this: 6 minutes can change the fate of nations and the lives of millions. 6 minutes during which American dive bombers plunged from the sky and delivered their bombs with precision onto the decks of Japanese carriers. 6 minutes during which fires erupted, explosions cascaded, and an empire's naval power was broken. If 6 minutes of focused action can have such profound and lasting consequences in war, what might 6 minutes of focused effort accomplish in our own lives, in our own time, in our own struggles? The men who fought at Midway faced their test and answered with extraordinary courage. The question their example poses to every generation that follows is simple and challenging. When our own moment of testing arrives, will we demonstrate the same clarity of purpose, the same willingness to sacrifice, the same refusal to surrender in the face of overwhelming odds?